Welcome to another episode of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, where we discuss ideas of democracy. Today we are joined by Dr. Catherine Musuva, who is a senior researcher at the African Center for Migration and Society. She is also a research associate at the Center for Research on Democracy at the University of Stellenbosch. Doc, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I want to begin this conversation by making a comment on how democracy kind of begin as a standard that every society has to work towards, to kind of work to. But lately we're seeing a regression on this, something that has been called a recession, a democracy recession, where democratic values are being hollowed out. And the line that is being used to kind of facilitate this hollowing out has been the immigration. I want to hear from you, what do you think is behind the rise of the immigrant on the electoral discourse in Africa?
Well, that's a very important question, and thank you again. I'm really delighted to be here today to discuss this important topic. Well, the rise of the immigration issue is not entirely new. Maybe there are a couple of things that are important to put in context in terms of, well, what the immigrant question is all about, in terms of it being a political issue. So the immigration question is really a shorthand way of talking about questions of who is allowed to enter the country, how long can they stay, and there's a whole regime of visas and the bureaucracy around that. Then the other aspect of immigrant integration is about immigrant integration and assimilation. When immigrants are in a particular country, what rights are they entitled to? Can they work? Can they go to school? Is there a pathway for them to become citizens? So I think those are the issues that I hope we will be delving into a bit deeper. But it's interesting to highlight the fact that the nation state or democracy in itself has an exclusionary element, because who is the demos? How do you define the demos? Even in Athenian democracy, it's not that there was no universal franchise. It was a certain group of people who could vote, and over time it was extended, from the wealthy, then it went to other segments of society and other places, and then to women, to Black people. So there's been that expansion of who falls within the demos. And unfortunately, in the kind of democracy that we are practicing in much of the continent, the demos excludes the foreigner or the stranger.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we are. Democracy, as you said in the beginning, is in, it's in some kind of crisis. It's in retreat, some would say. So this is a good time to be having these conversations about, where do we go from here?
Yeah. And what do you think? What has been the impact of this line, this on democracy? The immigrant, and what has been its impact on ideas of democracy coming from Africa?
Well, I mean, there's several impacts. Maybe one of the ones that come to mind is in terms of, elections and the immigration question being an electoral issue, where parties that are contesting the elections will be speaking to how, if they came into office, would handle who is allowed to come in, who is not. And so you find it now in political, certain countries like South Africa, for instance, the political parties in their manifestos will have a position on immigration. So it's becoming one of the issues, just as you would talk about, let's say, education or employment in this country. Another aspect of that is around belonging. And here I'm thinking of countries like Zambia. There was a time that President Kenneth Kaunda was accused of not being a Zambian, of being a Malawian. There was a time in the Congo, you will recall, when President Kabila was president, people said, oh, he's not Congolese, he's from Burundi, he's from Tanzania. So the point I'm trying to make is that the questions around belonging, who can run for office, who is a citizen, actually, that's where it starts. What's your claim to calling yourself a citizen of a particular country? It also goes to who is allowed to participate in politics. Why is it that a migrant who's a foreigner who's lived in a country, is paying taxes, has been there for a long time, is not allowed to vote? Or in some cases, or in many cases actually, to hold political office.
And the institutions, from your observation again, are they following suit in terms of the practices now of democracy, taking on from the impact of the immigrant? Are we seeing the institution following, or these are just ideas on political rhetoric that we're seeing from politicians, but disconnected from how the institutions work? Do they remain independent, or they follow suit on that discourse?
I don't know if you're referring to specific institutions, but for me, from the example I gave about immigration being a political issue around elections and the idea of who can participate in politics, elections are very much contested by political parties. Political parties are key institutions in a democracy. And so how they frame issues, how they frame contestation, how they come up with the rules of the game is really a key issue in terms of that being a core institution. But also you find that, for instance, again, in an electoral context where you determine who can vote, electoral commissions have to come up with a voters register. Who is the citizen? It's not all countries that have a system of IDs, and even where that is the case, it's usually intended to control and for law enforcement, not so much accessing rights, unfortunately, in the weak kind of states that we have on the continent. So you find in many countries where this kind of official documentation doesn't exist, to get yourself on the voters roll, you need somebody to vouch for you and say, I know you, two people to say and confirm that. And then that's how you're defined as a citizen. In some countries, the laws of citizenship or constitutions have changed over time. So how one is defined as a citizen and therefore entitled to rights, whether it's to vote, whether it's to jobs, to social services, is really a key issue. And sometimes, unfortunately, because of the emphasis on perhaps attaching people to a particular location or a particular territory, which is what the state does, you find that you can exclude people based on a name that doesn't sound like, I think you know what I'm trying to say. So institutions do get caught up in that, who is the citizen, who is not.
And who is not. And again, still on this theme of migration and democracy, usually, like, migrations are usually, I don't think we've spoken enough about the migrations within the continent, that I think a lot of migrations happen within the continent.
Yes.
And of course, this juxtaposing it with the post-colonial nation state and how it exercises its sovereignty through the borders, and how that moment itself starts creating the outsiders. I don't know if you can speak into this African foreigners in Africa. How does one become a foreigner in Africa?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Migration is historical. It's been there since, I guess, time immemorial, and people have always moved. There are certain known migratory routes on the continent that have been used for centuries. People traded with one another, intermarried. Also, there's just been a lot of movement, and the idea of people being rooted to a specific place really came with colonization. That's what indirect rule was about, and divide and rule, looking for a way to put people in particular, to fix them in particular places, so that you can govern. The borders that you're referring to in the colonial context were set up particularly for extraction purposes. It was not for, start a democracy here and, off you go. Yeah. It was, the resources here, plunder, exploit. How do we do this?
Yeah.
And fixing people. So I think that's a legacy that still defines modern day post-colonial African states.
Yeah.
When you talk about these borders now that, come maybe just to backtrack a bit, come independence, African states agreed to retain those boundaries despite the nature of how they came about. And ostensibly this was to avoid conflict, right? Conflict erupting after independence. But it was also how states got the sovereignty that you're talking about. Yeah. In the medieval times, movement was not really handled or controlled by the state. It was individuals and private entities that were involved in that enterprise. But now with the formation of the state, and the idea of sovereignty now extends to not just providing security and rights, but also deciding who comes in, who goes out, deciding how to give people identities. And that's how we are in a situation where we have the insiders and outsiders. But it's also interesting to highlight some of the ironies or paradoxes of colonialism in terms of, insiders and outsiders.
Yeah.
It was interesting that during that period, there was a preference for the outsider. If you think about how Indians or Asians ended up in Africa as indentured laborers, it's not that there were no locals to do their work, but there was the stereotype, and tropes around the lazy local. You can't trust the local, bring in labor from outside. Another example was also with the mines in South Africa, bring in the labor from outside, but they're people. And so there's that contradiction about favoring, in fact, the outsider and giving them more opportunities at the expense of the person that you found there.
This idea then of the borders and the movements within the continent, and how the post-colonial state exercises its sovereignty. How much of this has contributed also to the polarization, particularly, especially considering that these are still very young democracies?
Well, I think there are examples from when African states acquired independence of intolerance towards outsiders as a result of these borders and anti-immigrant sentiment. If you think about the late 1960s, early 70s, Nigerians being expelled from Ghana under the Aliens Act, and then later on Ghanaians being expelled from Nigeria, Beninese being expelled or, kicked out of Gabon. There's several examples in West Africa during that period, and then in later years and more recent times, we see what's happening in South Africa with, as a result of borders in a region where movement, like I said before, was happening unrestricted, and there was still some sense of law and order. And perhaps there's need to look into more of that. But it's disturbing that these borders in our context in Africa do not serve us well, because the borders, as I explained, how they came about. But when you think about free movement of people, if you're from Western Europe or the United States, you can travel anywhere in the world. You're free to come in and go as you like. And as a result of that, the extraction and the, I suppose, predatory relationship between the West and Africa continues to prevail. Yet they've erected borders saying that they don't want Africans in their countries. So Africans only have Africa. And yet in Africa, we still don't want people to move around. I don't think that serves us well.
And again, I want to go into your reflections of the elections, probably from the last 2 decades or so, where I think we've seen kind of tectonic shifts here in South Africa or in Kenya or Zambia. There's been some great shifts. And I want to hear your reflections in terms of, has there been attempts to bring the migrants into the political fold as political constituencies with rights, with full right? Has there been attempts, and how has this been received in these democracies?
Well, let me speak to that in the context of South Africa. And it's quite ironical, the manner in which the migrant question is discussed in this country. And I say that because on paper, in the Constitution, the preamble says that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity, right? So that's an effort to be inclusive. But that's not the case. That's not the reality. So I think the ideals are there. They exist in constitutions. That's a very progressive way to define citizenship, where it's not based on the soil where you were born, where you'll be buried. It's, you're here, you live here, we're a diverse country. But that's definitely not how it works. There's a path to citizenship, a legal path. But the reality of navigating that system and ultimately acquiring citizenship after having been here as a resident for a long time is very difficult. So I think we need to bridge that gap, basically, is what I would say, that normatively, idealistically, we framed our laws in the right way, in a progressive way. But in reality, we need to move beyond those fixed territorial and rigid categories and embrace multiple forms of belonging and perhaps cosmopolitan identities as well.
And in terms of how these countries govern, and again, I'm doing these comparatives to try and maybe give us a sense of, I don't know, like a sense of how democracies work within different democracies. different countries in Africa. But looking at Kenya, South Africa case, for instance, in terms of how they govern migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, what key insights can we glean from these countries?
Well, I think it's important to highlight context, right? That a lot of these policies and I suppose procedures around and even how issues are framed has to do with the politics or the history or even socioeconomic factors. Kenya, as you know, hosts a very large refugee population from neighboring countries, from Somalia, from South Sudan, and it's normal that when a conflict breaks out, people will move to the nearest place. They're not going to cross there are those who will cross the ocean or take a plane, but usually the first place they go is next door. And so for a long time, Kenya has hosted a lot of people from these countries. I suppose it's different in South Africa, where the neighborhood is comparatively peaceful, but there's the history of migrant labor, which does not exist in Kenya in the same way that it does. And so the issue here is around the rights of migrants who were allowed in previously during the two gates immigration system, versus now in a democratic dispensation, what happens. So I think both countries in their own different ways are not immune to having people from outside their borders in their countries, but also both countries have emigration. There's a large diaspora community, the people who've left South Africa since 1994 and increasingly, have gone to Australia, the UK, wherever. Yeah. Kenya's biggest diaspora is also outside the continent. So the movements also, are both ways. Yeah. And then the question comes when you have people from your country who've left, then what rights do they still enjoy as citizens of your country? Or do they also then want to belong to the new place they've moved to and become part of that? If it's a democracy, because people tend to want to live in democracies because of the stability of democratic countries and the economic prosperity that can potentially come out of that kind of environment where rights are respected. And so I suppose we have a long way to go in terms of protecting people's rights in our democracies, protecting minorities in particular.
I think my next question is on the idea of rethinking democracy, because it's clear that we haven't really thought of democracy from the outsider perspective. Democracy is still very much located on the idea of the insider and the future of citizenship. And I'm wondering if you can talk to that.
That's a very important question. I think when we talk about rethinking democracy, it's, to me, about contextualizing democracy, because we have on the continent adopted various forms of liberal democracy, or we've sort of seen democracy as something external to us. Yet we know that historically African societies had forms of organization and belonging and identity that were or could be described as democratic, to the extent that they were based on getting views and opinions of the people, consulting. They were based on consensus, building consensus, solving problems, reducing conflict. And I think those are important mechanisms to have in our democracies, they would strengthen our democracies. So when for me, talking about rethinking democracy would be tapping into some of those attributes that would strengthen our democracy that are not very visible or very spoken about, and perhaps even less emphasis on the procedural part of democracy. There's a very heavy emphasis on, there's so many elections happening. This is a big election year, but what's the quality of those elections? How inclusive are they? There are countries where elections are captured, elections are still rigged. There's electoral fraud. But more importantly, what kind of change comes out of these electoral processes? So that's important in terms of what does democracy deliver to Africans. And I think we have a lot to think about in terms of uplifting the standards of Africans, because Africa really is all they have. In terms of citizenship, I think that's a way of rethinking or reimagining democracy. And here I would suggest broadening the definition of citizenship. We spoke about this earlier in terms of how the nation state has perpetuated a very narrow and nativist discourse around citizenship, yet citizenship can actually encompass more than where you were born. So the idea of thinking about multiple forms of belonging, especially in the context of increased urbanization, in the context of a large youthful population that would identify itself differently perhaps from earlier generations, that's exposed and maybe have had an experience living in another country or another part of their own country. What does that mean? So moving away, in other words, from a very fixed and narrow definition of citizenship to perhaps broadening, and that would allow for more inclusion and for ways that the stranger can actually become a friend.
I think the idea of rethinking democracy by extending citizenship makes more sense. But it's interesting how it would pan out in the age of the externalization of borders, where Europe, for instance, is sending its asylum seekers back to Rwanda. I'm wondering if you can talk to this about its impact on Africa, but also its impact on democracy through this externalization of borders.
Well, the externalization of borders, to me, is just yet another way of revealing how much of a footprint, I would say, the global North has on Africa. It was initially the resources, now the people. So it's very sad to see, for instance, how the Southern European border now is actually no longer in Europe, but in Africa, in Morocco. You can't. They've put up the fences there already. The border guards are in Morocco to prevent people from West Africa, whatever the migratory route is there around West Africa to go to Europe, to already be stopped while they're still in Africa. There are a lot of deaths that happen in the Mediterranean Sea that are unspoken of, unreported. So I think the impact is further dehumanizing and humiliating Africans. I really don't know how else to describe the impact of that. Related to that is also this new policies around asylum, the Rwanda, for instance, the UK policy on processing asylum in Rwanda, following on from what Australia has been doing in the Pacific Islands, having camps there to process. Again, it's putting up those borders so that people cannot come, but also, what's the deal? It's supposed to be in exchange for aid or in exchange for some kind of benefits. I mean, the UK one did not quite see the light of day. There's a new government now, and the Prime Minister has said that his government is going to repeal that law. But I think even just the essence of it, the whole idea of it, it doesn't make sense to me, really. Human rights are supposed to be universal. And how is it that Rwanda would be able to protect human rights, but the UK is not able to protect human rights? There's a double standard there.
And then my last question is on your reflections on the recent elections here in South Africa, which brought what is being called a government of national unity. What are the futures of immigration? Does it have any positive futures? What are your thoughts on it?
I suppose it's still early days and time will tell, but I can point out the fact that the different parties that are now in government have different policy positions on the migration question. And prior to the last election, there was an effort to overhaul the immigration framework of the country. So it remains to be seen how that will progress or stall under the new government, and how the different interests of the parties that are now in government will feed into that process. But like I said earlier, it's admirable that South Africa has a progressive way of defining citizenship, a broad way of defining citizenship in its constitution. And I think if that gap between what the constitution says and how foreigners in South Africa are treated can be bridged, then that would augur well for South Africa's democracy in terms of becoming more inclusive and managing diversity for the benefit of all who live in South Africa.
Well, from rethinking citizenship as a way of expanding democracy and creating democracy for the outsider, that was it from today. Thank you so much for joining. Remember to like, to share, and to subscribe. Thank you.